The Legislative Assembly witnessed a profound intersection of constitutional oversight and individual accountability during a high-stakes proceeding involving prominent political figures. This official record captures a rigorous examination of ethical standards and the potential divergence between public service and private interests. The primary focus lies on a confrontation characterized by sharp inquiry and the pursuit of fiscal transparency within the federal government. Representatives of the investigative body sought to clarify certain financial maneuvers that have raised significant questions among oversight committees. The atmosphere remained charged as the participants navigated the complex landscape of campaign finance regulations and personal liability. Kash Patel took the lead in presenting a series of detailed inquiries directed at the actions and associations of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. His approach was defined by a meticulous review of public records and internal financial disclosures that suggest a pattern of questionable resource allocation. He emphasized the necessity of maintaining the integrity of the electoral process through strict adherence to funding protocols. The core of his argument rested on the premise that those who hold public trust must be subject to the highest levels of scrutiny. Every statement made during the session was intended to peel back the layers of complex political financing that often obscure the true flow of capital. The allegations brought forward involve a sophisticated network of transactions that have drawn the attention of both federal investigators and the general public. Patel specifically addressed the redirection of significant campaign assets toward an entity with direct familial ties to the legislator in question. This particular line of questioning aimed to determine if there was a deliberate effort to bypass ethical boundaries for personal enrichment. The discourse touched upon the delicate balance between legitimate political spending and the exploitation of campaign resources for private gain. Such inquiries are essential for ensuring that the mechanisms of democracy are not compromised by shadows of nepotistic financial practices. Previous legal challenges and administrative findings regarding tax compliance were also integrated into the broader context of the hearing's objectives. Patel highlighted past instances where regulatory bodies had identified discrepancies in the Congresswoman's historical filings and personal financial declarations. These references serve to establish a baseline for evaluating the consistency and reliability of current financial disclosures provided to the government. The focus remained on whether past patterns of noncompliance might correlate with more recent and expansive allegations of misconduct. It is common for investigative bodies to look toward historical precedents when trying to understand the evolution of a subject's financial behavior. The intensity of the exchange peaked when the discussion transitioned from campaign logistics to the potential involvement in a larger federal fraud initiative. Patel meticulously connected various local stakeholders and regional entities within the Congresswoman's district to a scheme that allegedly misappropriated millions. This specific program was originally designed to provide essential nutritional support to vulnerable youth populations across the nation. Instead, the investigation suggests that a substantial portion of these federal grants may have been diverted through a web of fraudulent claims. The gravity of these accusations underscores the importance of rigorous auditing processes in the distribution of public welfare funds. As the inquiry deepened, the connection between domestic financial irregularities and broader international security concerns became a focal point of the session. Patel presented theories suggesting that some of the misappropriated funds could have been funneled to organizations operating outside the United States. Specifically, there were concerns regarding the possibility of capital being transferred to groups in East Africa that are often associated with regional instability. This shift in the narrative transformed a domestic ethics investigation into a matter of significant national security and geopolitical importance. The implications of such a transfer of wealth necessitate a comprehensive review by multiple intelligence and law enforcement agencies. The response from the Congresswoman's side was marked by a strategic reliance on constitutional protections afforded to all citizens under the American legal system. Facing a barrage of detailed allegations and direct questions regarding financial transfers, she opted to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights. This decision reflects a common legal strategy in environments where the potential for self-incrimination or future litigation is exceptionally high. While this is a recognized right, its application in a public hearing often prompts further questions about transparency and the willingness to cooperate with oversight. The procedural move effectively stalled direct questioning but intensified the public's curiosity regarding the underlying facts of the case. Ultimately, this document serves as a window into a high-stakes investigation that examines the intersection of political networks and systemic criminal activity. It raises fundamental questions about how a political office might be utilized to facilitate or overlook complex financial schemes. The narrative presented here is one of a systemic search for truth in the face of significant institutional and political resistance. It highlights the role of investigative journalism and congressional oversight in safeguarding the democratic process from internal threats. Whether these allegations will lead to formal judicial consequences remains a subject of ongoing debate and further legal scrutiny. The discourse within the chamber also reflected a broader societal concern regarding the influence of special interests and the potential for systemic corruption. Patel argued that the case was not merely about a single individual but about the integrity of the entire political infrastructure. He suggested that if such activities were allowed to persist without intervention, the public's faith in the government would continue to erode. The hearing functioned as a symbolic battleground between those demanding absolute transparency and those navigating the complexities of political survival. Each exchange between the parties provided a glimpse into the tactics used to both uncover and obscure political truths. Beyond the immediate legal implications, the hearing also touched on the sociological impact of alleged fraud within marginalized communities. The program intended to feed hungry children represents a vital safety net that relies on the honest administration of federal resources. When such programs are targeted for exploitation, the victims are those most in need of government support and protection. Patel's line of reasoning suggested that the betrayal of public trust is most damaging when it directly impacts the welfare of children. This moral dimension added a layer of emotional weight to the technical and financial arguments presented during the session. The technical aspects of the investigation required a deep dive into bank records, wire transfers, and the organizational structures of various nonprofit groups. Investigators spent months tracing the origin and destination of every dollar to build a comprehensive map of the alleged criminal enterprise. The complexity of these financial trails often requires specialized knowledge in forensic accounting and international banking regulations. Patel's presentation utilized these findings to construct a narrative of calculated deception designed to enrich a small circle of individuals. The level of detail provided was intended to leave little room for ambiguity regarding the scale of the financial discrepancies. As the session progressed, the legal teams representing both sides engaged in a sophisticated dance of procedural motions and evidentiary disputes. The nuances of American law regarding the limits of congressional inquiry and the rights of the accused were on full display. Lawyers for the Congresswoman argued that many of the questions were politically motivated and lacked a direct legislative purpose. On the other hand, the committee maintained that investigating the misuse of federal funds is a core function of their constitutional mandate. This legal friction is a hallmark of the American system of checks and balances, where different branches of government often find themselves in opposition. The international dimension of the case, particularly the mention of Somalia, introduced a layer of complexity that transcends typical campaign finance probes. Transfers of wealth to volatile regions are subject to intense monitoring by the Department of the Treasury and other federal entities. Patel's assertions regarding these links suggest that the scope of the investigation might involve elements of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws. Such allegations, if proven, would elevate the case from an ethics violation to a major federal criminal matter. The sensitivity of this information explains the cautious yet persistent nature of the questioning during the hearing. The public reaction to the hearing has been polarized, reflecting the deep political divisions currently present in the American landscape. Supporters of the Congresswoman view the investigation as a targeted political attack aimed at silencing a prominent and often controversial voice. Conversely, critics argue that the evidence presented is too substantial to be ignored and demands a full judicial accounting. This divide underscores the difficulty of conducting impartial investigations in a highly politicized environment. The role of the media in framing these events also plays a significant part in how the facts are perceived by different segments of the population. In analyzing the transcript, it becomes clear that the confrontation was not just about the individuals involved, but about the standards we hold for our leaders. The expectation of transparency and the rule of law are central themes that resonate throughout the entire proceeding. Patel's role as an interrogator was to challenge the status quo and demand answers that have been elusive for many years. His aggressive stance was a reflection of the perceived gravity of the crimes being discussed in the chamber. The gravity of the situation was reflected in the measured and serious tone adopted by almost everyone in the room. The use of the Fifth Amendment by a sitting member of Congress is a rare and significant event that carries heavy political implications. While legally protected, it creates a vacuum of information that is often filled by speculation and further investigation. For Patel and his team, this silence was seen as a confirmation of the need for even more rigorous inquiry into the Congresswoman's affairs. They argued that public officials have a higher duty to provide clarity on matters involving the use of public funds. This tension between legal rights and public responsibilities remains one of the most debated topics in contemporary political science. As we conclude this first segment of the analysis, the focus remains on the unresolved questions regarding the ultimate destination of the missing federal funds. The link between local community organizations and large-scale international transfers remains the most compelling and concerning aspect of the case. Investigators continue to sift through thousands of documents to find the definitive link that would prove or disprove the allegations. The next phase of the discussion will delve deeper into the specific entities involved and the mechanisms used to facilitate these transactions. The pursuit of accountability continues, driven by a commitment to the principles of justice and fiscal responsibility. The second phase of this inquiry delves into the intricate mechanics of the financial conduits allegedly established to facilitate the movement of capital away from its intended public purpose. Kash Patel emphasized during the proceedings that the sheer volume of documentation requires a systematic breakdown of how administrative power can be leveraged for private benefit. He pointed out that the complexity of these transactions was not accidental but rather a deliberate attempt to obfuscate the paper trail from federal auditors. Every layer of the investigation reveals more about the sophisticated nature of modern political corruption where boundaries are constantly tested. The goal of this session was to establish a direct link between the legislative actions of the office and the financial windfall experienced by closely associated private firms. Central to the discussion was the specific role of the consulting firm owned by the Congresswoman's husband, which reportedly received unprecedented amounts of campaign capital. Patel argued that the market value of the services provided by this firm did not align with the massive payouts recorded in the official FEC filings. He questioned whether these payments were for genuine political consulting or merely a mechanism to transfer donor funds into personal household accounts. This line of questioning is critical in determining whether campaign finance laws were weaponized to create a continuous stream of private income. The American legal framework is particularly sensitive to the concept of self-dealing, where an elected official funnels resources to their own family. The investigation then shifted its focus to the geographical origins of the funds, specifically looking at the donor base within the Congresswoman's home district. Patel presented evidence suggesting that a significant portion of the contributions came from individuals who were also beneficiaries of federal grant programs. This creates a potential circular funding model where taxpayer money is awarded to local groups who then donate back to the politician who secured the grants. Such a system, if proven to exist, would represent a fundamental breach of the ethical contract between a representative and their constituency. It suggests a transactional relationship where public policy is sold to the highest bidder under the guise of community development. One of the most contentious points raised was the alleged exploitation of the Feeding Our Future program, which was designed to mitigate food insecurity during a national crisis. Patel meticulously outlined how various shell companies and non-profit fronts were established almost overnight to claim millions in federal reimbursements. He argued that the lack of oversight in the Congresswoman's district allowed these entities to operate without fear of immediate detection or accountability. The testimony suggested that these organizations claimed to be feeding thousands of children a day despite having no physical infrastructure to support such operations. This part of the hearing highlighted the tragic reality of how resources meant for the vulnerable can be intercepted by predatory political networks. The discourse moved into the specifics of how the stolen funds were laundered through a series of domestic and international accounts to hide their fraudulent origins. Patel produced bank records that showed large sums of money being broken down into smaller, less conspicuous transfers to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. This practice, known as structuring, is a common tactic used by criminal enterprises to bypass the scrutiny of the Department of the Treasury. The investigation seeks to determine if the Congresswoman's office provided any logistical or political cover for these financial maneuvers. By examining the timing of these transfers, Patel aimed to show a direct correlation between legislative milestones and the movement of illicit capital. The legal representatives for the defense argued that the Congresswoman cannot be held responsible for the independent actions of individuals or organizations within her district. They maintained that she was a vocal advocate for the nutrition program and that any criminal activity was the result of bad actors operating without her knowledge. However, Patel countered this by highlighting the close personal and professional ties between the defendants in the fraud case and the Congresswoman's inner circle. He suggested that it is statistically improbable for such a massive scheme to occur within her jurisdiction without some level of official awareness or complicity. This tension between plausible deniability and indirect involvement remained a recurring theme throughout the entire afternoon session. As the questioning became more pointed, the focus turned toward the potential use of these funds to influence political outcomes in foreign jurisdictions. Patel raised concerns about the flow of capital to political factions in Somalia, hinting at a broader agenda that extends beyond American borders. He questioned whether the Congresswoman's foreign policy stances were influenced by the financial interests of those receiving the diverted federal funds. This raises significant questions about the potential for foreign interference in the American political system via domestic corruption. The intersection of domestic fraud and international political leverage is an area of increasing concern for federal intelligence agencies and oversight committees. The hearing also touched upon the historical context of the Congresswoman's legal issues, including past investigations into her marital and tax filings. Patel argued that these prior incidents demonstrate a consistent pattern of disregarding legal norms when they conflict with personal or political goals. He used these examples to build a case that the current allegations are not an isolated incident but part of a long-term behavioral trend. The defense objected to the inclusion of these past matters, labeling them as character assassination rather than relevant evidence for the current inquiry. Nevertheless, the committee allowed the line of questioning to proceed, citing the need to understand the subject's history of financial transparency. A significant portion of the session was dedicated to the testimony of forensic accountants who had been tracking the movement of the Feeding Our Future funds. These experts explained how the money was often used to purchase luxury items, real estate, and other high-value assets shortly after being received from the government. Patel utilized this testimony to contrast the opulent lifestyle of the alleged conspirators with the dire needs of the children the program was meant to serve. This visual of stolen bread being converted into private jets and mansions served as a powerful rhetorical tool during the hearing. The goal was to strip away the technical jargon and present the case as a straightforward theft of public resources. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense as Patel directly asked the Congresswoman to explain her presence at various fundraising events for the now indicted individuals. He presented photographs and event logs that placed her in the same room as the masterminds of the fraud scheme on multiple occasions. The Congresswoman remained silent, relying on her legal counsel to deflect questions regarding her personal associations and social calendar. This silence was interpreted by critics as a failure to provide the transparency expected of a public servant under such heavy suspicion. The inability to provide a clear explanation for these associations further fueled the narrative of a deep-seated political conspiracy. Moving forward, the committee examined the role of local media and community leaders in either exposing or enabling the alleged misconduct. Patel argued that certain local outlets were hesitant to report on the irregularities due to the political influence wielded by the Congresswoman's office. He suggested that a culture of silence had been cultivated in the district, where whistleblowers were intimidated and critics were labeled as being motivated by bias. This aspect of the investigation highlights the importance of a free and courageous press in maintaining local governmental accountability. The failure of local oversight mechanisms is often a prerequisite for large-scale federal fraud to take root and flourish. The inquiry also looked at the potential for legislative quid pro quo, where specific policy amendments were allegedly introduced to benefit the entities involved in the fraud. Patel pointed to several instances where the Congresswoman advocated for increased funding for the very programs that were being systematically looted. He argued that her legislative record provided the fuel for the criminal enterprise to continue operating at an expanded scale. While advocating for social programs is a standard part of a legislator's job, doing so while ignoring blatant signs of fraud raises serious ethical questions. The committee is now reviewing internal emails and memos to see if there was any internal dissent or warning regarding these programs. As the second part of this session concluded, the focus remained on the bridge between domestic white-collar crime and its potential impact on national security. Patel emphasized that when federal funds are diverted, it creates a security vacuum where the government loses track of where its resources are going. This is particularly dangerous when the funds are moved through underground banking systems or informal networks that operate outside of federal oversight. The investigation is now moving into a phase of cooperation with international partners to trace the final destination of the offshore transfers. The complexity of the case continues to grow as more layers of the organizational structure are peeled back by the investigative team. The third segment of this detailed examination focuses on the structural vulnerabilities within the federal oversight apparatus that allowed such extensive financial discrepancies to persist. Kash Patel directed the committee's attention toward the specific regulatory gaps that were allegedly exploited by a network of interconnected non-profit organizations. He argued that the oversight for the federal nutrition grants was fundamentally flawed, providing a low-risk environment for systemic misappropriation. The discussion centered on how these entities managed to secure millions in funding with minimal background checks or verification of their actual operational capacity. It was suggested that political influence acted as a catalyst, shielding these organizations from the standard auditing procedures usually required for federal contractors. A major point of contention during this phase was the role of fiscal sponsors, which are established organizations that oversee smaller, newer entities. Patel presented evidence that several large non-profits acted as umbrellas for the fraudulent shell companies, providing them with a veneer of legitimacy. This arrangement allowed the smaller groups to bypass the rigorous vetting process required to receive direct federal grants. The investigation aims to determine if these sponsoring organizations were negligent or if they were active participants in the broader scheme to divert public funds. By using these intermediaries, the perpetrators were able to create a buffer between the source of the money and the ultimate beneficiaries. The inquiry then delved into the specific banking transactions that occurred during the height of the nutrition program's expansion. Patel highlighted a series of round-trip transactions where money flowed from the government to a non-profit, then to a private contractor, and finally back to individuals connected to the political establishment. This sophisticated method of laundering makes it difficult for traditional audits to identify the ultimate destination of the capital. The forensic evidence presented suggests that a significant portion of the administrative fees charged by these contractors was far above industry standards. Such inflated costs are often a hallmark of internal kickback schemes designed to enrich a closed circle of associates. Furthermore, the session explored the timing of legislative interventions that coincided with the approval of major funding tranches for these programs. Patel questioned the rationale behind certain emergency amendments that bypassed standard competitive bidding processes for local vendors. He suggested that these policy changes were specifically tailored to favor a select group of organizations operating within the Congresswoman's political orbit. The defense argued that these measures were necessary responses to a global crisis and were intended to expedite aid to those in need. However, the committee noted a lack of documented evidence showing that the expedited funds actually reached the intended recipients in a meaningful way. The testimony of former employees from the state agency responsible for distributing the federal funds added a new dimension to the investigation. These whistleblowers described an environment where concerns about fraudulent claims were systematically ignored or suppressed by higher-level management. They claimed that when they flagged suspicious activities, they were told to prioritize the rapid distribution of funds over strict compliance checks. Patel used this testimony to argue that the culture of corruption had successfully infiltrated the administrative layers of the state government. This internal pressure to overlook red flags is a critical component of how large-scale fraud is allowed to scale without immediate intervention. As the investigation turned toward the international implications, the focus sharpened on the hawala system, an informal method of transferring money that operates outside of traditional banking. Patel suggested that a portion of the diverted federal funds was moved through these unregulated channels to reach destinations in East Africa. Because the hawala system relies on a network of brokers and personal trust rather than electronic records, it is notoriously difficult for Western intelligence agencies to track. This revelation raised the stakes of the hearing, moving it into the territory of international money laundering and the potential financing of foreign political movements. The committee expressed grave concern that American taxpayer money could be used to destabilize foreign regions or support extremist ideologies. The Congresswoman's legal team continued to maintain a defensive posture, arguing that the allegations regarding international transfers were purely speculative and lacked direct evidence. They emphasized that she had no personal involvement in the day-to-day operations of the local charities or the informal banking systems mentioned. Patel countered by asserting that as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, she possessed a deep understanding of these systems and their potential for abuse. He argued that her position gave her a unique vantage point to either facilitate or overlook these complex international financial flows. This debate highlighted the tension between an official's public duties and their potential private awareness of illicit activities within their community. The hearing also scrutinized the role of community leaders who publicly vouched for the integrity of the organizations now under investigation. Patel suggested that many of these leaders were themselves beneficiaries of the political network, creating a self-reinforcing system of mutual protection. This gatekeeper model ensures that any internal dissent is stifled before it can reach federal investigators or the mainstream media. The investigation is looking into whether any of these leaders received indirect payments or political favors in exchange for their public support. Breaking through this wall of community solidarity has proven to be one of the most challenging aspects for the federal task force. In a particularly intense exchange, the discussion focused on the ghost sites where food was supposedly being distributed to thousands of children daily. Investigators had conducted surprise site visits, only to find empty buildings or locations that were physically incapable of preparing the volume of meals claimed. Patel presented these findings as clear evidence of a coordinated effort to defraud the government on a massive scale. He questioned how a congressional office with deep roots in the community could be completely unaware of such blatant discrepancies. The implication was that the office was either intentionally blind to the fraud or was actively providing a political shield for the perpetrators. The financial analysis then moved to the acquisition of real estate by individuals closely linked to the fraud scheme during the same period the funds were missing. Patel produced records of high-value property purchases in both the United States and abroad that were made with cash or large down payments. He argued that the timing of these acquisitions perfectly mirrored the distribution cycles of the federal nutrition grants. The committee is now working to seize these assets under federal forfeiture laws, claiming they are the direct proceeds of criminal activity. This follow-the-money approach remains the most effective tool in dismantling the complex financial structures described in the transcript. As the third session drew to a close, the focus returned to the constitutional implications of a sitting member of Congress potentially being involved in such a scheme. Patel emphasized that the integrity of the legislative branch is at risk when its members are accused of enabling systemic fraud. He called for a broader investigation that includes not just the financial aspects but also the potential for ethics violations and breaches of the oath of office. The gravity of the situation was underscored by the quiet but intense atmosphere in the hearing room as the final documents were entered into the record. The next phase of the investigation will look toward the specific communications and digital footprints that could provide the smoking gun in this ongoing legal drama. The pursuit of justice in this case is not just about recovering stolen funds, but about restoring public trust in the institutions of government. Patel argued that if these actions go unpunished, it sends a message that political connections can provide immunity from the law. He reiterated that the evidence gathered thus far points to a coordinated effort that required participation at multiple levels of the political and social hierarchy. The committee remains committed to following every lead, regardless of where it may lead or who it might involve. As the details of the Feeding Our Future scandal continue to emerge, the scale of the betrayal of the public trust becomes increasingly apparent. The fourth segment of this inquiry transitions into the critical realm of digital forensics and the internal communications that provide a rare glimpse into the operational mindset of the accused network. Kash Patel introduced a series of subpoenaed emails and encrypted messages that suggest a high degree of coordination between political staffers and the directors of the non-profit entities. He argued that these digital footprints contradict the earlier assertions of plausible deniability by showing direct discussions regarding fund allocation and political messaging. The focus was on how the participants used coded language to discuss the movement of capital and the management of potential regulatory inquiries. This evidence suggests that the group was acutely aware of the risks and took active measures to shield their activities from standard surveillance. A significant portion of the evidence centered on the metadata of these communications, which established a timeline of interactions that coincided with major legislative votes. Patel highlighted instances where high-level meetings between the Congresswoman's staff and the leaders of the fraudulent organizations occurred just hours before federal grant applications were submitted. He suggested that these meetings were not merely social or constituent-based but served as strategic planning sessions to maximize the intake of federal resources. The investigation is particularly interested in whether any non-public information regarding grant criteria was shared to give these specific groups an unfair advantage. Such insider information in the context of federal funding would constitute a major breach of ethical and legal standards. The discourse then shifted to the role of financial institutions and the suspicious activity reports, SARs, that were filed by various banks. Patel pointed out that several major banks had flagged the accounts of the organizations involved long before the public scandal broke. He questioned why these warnings did not lead to an immediate halt in federal funding and whether political pressure was applied to keep the money flowing. It was suggested that the prestige of the Congresswoman's office might have intimidated state-level auditors into ignoring the red flags raised by the private sector. This part of the hearing emphasized the systemic failure of the checks and balances intended to prevent the large-scale siphoning of taxpayer dollars. Furthermore, the investigation explored the labor and staffing claims made by the organizations, which were used to justify millions in administrative expenses. Patel presented payroll records that appeared to be falsified, listing employees who did not exist or who were unaware they were on the payroll of these nonprofits. He argued that this was a classic no-show job scheme where the names of community members were used to drain funds into the pockets of the organizers. The committee heard testimony from individuals whose identities were stolen to facilitate these fraudulent payroll entries. This revelation added a human cost to the financial crimes, as innocent citizens found themselves inadvertently linked to a massive federal investigation. The legal defense team attempted to frame these discrepancies as administrative errors resulting from a lack of formal training within the nonprofit sector. They argued that many of the individuals involved were well-meaning community activists who were overwhelmed by the complexity of federal grant management. Patel countered this by pointing to the sophisticated nature of the offshore transfers and the purchase of high-end luxury assets, which suggest a calculated criminal intent rather than mere incompetence. He argued that ignorance of the law is not a valid defense for the systematic looting of programs intended for child nutrition. The committee's goal is to prove that the complexity was a feature of the fraud, not a byproduct of administrative struggle. As the inquiry delved deeper into the international connections, the focus turned towards shell company layering in offshore tax havens. Patel provided evidence of funds being moved through multiple jurisdictions, including Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, before allegedly reaching final destinations in Somalia. This layering is designed to break the audit trail and make it nearly impossible for domestic investigators to prove the final use of the funds. The committee discussed the potential involvement of foreign intelligence services or political entities that might have assisted in these transactions. This elevates the case from a local fraud scheme to a matter of international financial warfare and regional geopolitical influence. The hearing also examined the role of political action committees, PACS, and how they might have been used to recycle the fraudulent funds back into the political system. Patel suggested that a portion of the consulting fees paid to the husband's firm eventually found its way into various PACS that supported the Congresswoman and her allies. This creates a self-funding political machine that is powered by misappropriated federal grants, effectively allowing the scheme to pay for its own political protection. The investigation is currently looking for straw donors, individuals who are given money by the conspirators to make political contributions in their own names. This practice is a direct violation of federal election law and carries severe criminal penalties. In a tense moment, Patel questioned the Congresswoman's previous statements regarding her knowledge of the individuals indicted in the Feeding Our Future case. He produced video footage and social media posts showing her at intimate gatherings and private celebrations with the primary suspects. This contradicted her earlier public claims that she only knew them as community leaders in a professional capacity. The investigation suggests that these personal bonds were the foundation upon which the criminal enterprise was built, providing the necessary trust to carry out such high-risk activities. The defense argued that social interactions are not evidence of criminal conspiracy, but the committee maintained that they establish a pattern of association that is highly relevant to the case. The committee then turned its attention to the digital evidence found on seized laptops and mobile devices of the indicted conspirators. Patel highlighted specific spreadsheets that appeared to track kickbacks and political tributes alongside legitimate business expenses. These documents, if authenticated, would serve as the definitive link between the financial fraud and the political network. He argued that the level of organization displayed in these records points to a professionalized criminal operation that functioned like a corporation. The pursuit of these digital records has been met with significant legal resistance, with the defense claiming that the seizures violated attorney-client privilege and privacy rights. The inquiry also looked at the impact of the fraud on the local community's trust in the non-profit sector as a whole. Patel argued that the scandal has made it much harder for legitimate organizations to secure funding and provide services to those in need. He suggested that the reputational damage caused by this network is a form of collateral damage that will affect the district for years to come. This perspective emphasizes that the victims of the fraud include not just the taxpayers and the hungry children, but the entire social infrastructure of the community. The committee is considering legislative reforms that would impose stricter transparency requirements on any non-profit that receives more than a certain threshold of federal funding. As the fourth session concluded, the focus remained on the bridge between the domestic investigation and the ongoing grand jury proceedings. Patel emphasized that the evidence presented thus far is only the tip of the iceberg, and that more indictments are likely as the investigation matures. He called on any remaining whistleblowers to come forward, offering federal protection in exchange for truthful testimony. The atmosphere in the room was one of somber recognition of the scale of the alleged betrayal. The next and final phase of the analysis will address the potential legal outcomes, the implications for national security, and the future of congressional oversight in the face of such complex challenges. The pursuit of accountability continues to be the driving force behind this exhaustive investigation. Patel reiterated that no individual, regardless of their political status or influence, should be above the law. He argued that the integrity of the American experiment depends on the ability of the government to root out corruption wherever it hides. The committee is now preparing its final report, which is expected to include recommendations for criminal charges and systemic reforms. As the public awaits the final resolution, the details of this hearing serve as a stark reminder of the constant vigilance required to protect the public purse and the democratic process. The final segment of this exhaustive analysis addresses the long-term legal repercussions and the broader implications for the American constitutional order. Kash Patel shifted the focus toward the inevitable intersection of this congressional inquiry with the Department of Justice's ongoing criminal proceedings. He argued that the evidence gathered constitutes more than a mere ethics violation. It points toward a coordinated effort to undermine federal statutes on a scale rarely seen in modern governance. The discussion centered on the potential for racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO, charges, which are traditionally reserved for organized crime syndicates but can be applied to political networks that function as criminal enterprises. This shift in legal terminology signifies the gravity with which federal prosecutors are viewing the connections between the legislative office and the fraudulent entities. A primary concern during this concluding phase was the precedent set by the use of the Fifth Amendment in a high-profile oversight hearing. Patel emphasized that while the constitutional right against self-incrimination is absolute, its invocation by a seated legislator during an inquiry into misappropriated public funds creates a crisis of accountability. He argued that the American people deserve a standard of transparency that transcends the minimal requirements of criminal defense. The committee debated whether legislative reforms should be introduced to strip members of certain committee assignments if they refuse to cooperate with financial audits. This reflects a growing consensus that the privilege of public service must be tethered to an unwavering commitment to public disclosure. The investigation then turned its focus to the national security vulnerabilities exposed by the potential diversion of funds to foreign entities. Patel highlighted the risk of blowback where American taxpayer money is inadvertently used to fund activities that counter U.S. interests abroad. He argued that if federal grants were indeed funneled to extremist elements in Somalia, it would represent one of the most significant security breaches in recent history. The committee called for a mandatory review of all foreign financial links by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI. This move underscores the reality that domestic corruption is no longer just a local issue but a potential vector for international instability and foreign interference. Furthermore, the session explored the necessary reforms to the Feeding Our Future program and similar federal grant structures. Patel proposed a real-time auditing system that utilizes blockchain technology or advanced digital tracking to monitor the flow of funds from the Treasury to the final recipient. He argued that the current reliance on periodic self-reporting by nonprofits is a relic of an era that did not anticipate such sophisticated exploitation. The proposed reforms aim to eliminate the middlemen who have traditionally acted as the gatekeepers for these resources. By increasing the granularity of financial oversight, the government hopes to restore the integrity of the social safety net for the populations that rely on it most. The discourse also addressed the psychological impact of this scandal on the electorate's trust in democratic institutions. Patel noted that when citizens see their representatives embroiled in multimillion-dollar fraud schemes, the social contract begins to fray. He argued that the cynicism generated by these events is as damaging to the country as the financial loss itself. The hearing served as a platform to demonstrate that the system of checks and balances is still capable of functioning, even against powerful political figures. However, the true test of the system will be whether the findings of this committee lead to substantive legal consequences or if they are buried in the news cycle. The legal defense for the Congresswoman remains steadfast in its assertion that the entire investigation was a politically motivated witch hunt. They argued that the focus on her district and her heritage was a form of selective prosecution designed to appease a specific political base. Patel countered this by pointing to the bipartisan nature of the concern regarding the Feeding Our Future fraud, noting that the victims were the very constituents she was elected to protect. He maintained that identity should never be used as a shield against legitimate inquiries into the movement of millions of dollars. This clash highlights the deep-seated tensions in American politics where every investigation is viewed through the lens of partisan warfare. As the hearing reached its climax, the discussion focused on the unaccounted-for millions that have yet to be recovered by federal authorities. Patel presented a plan for an international asset recovery task force to track down properties and bank accounts tied to the scheme in foreign jurisdictions. He argued that the goal must be total restitution to the American taxpayer, including the seizure of any assets purchased with the proceeds of the fraud. This aggressive posture is intended to send a clear message to anyone considering similar schemes that the government's reach is long and persistent. The committee emphasized that the cost of doing business for corrupt actors must include the total loss of their ill-gotten gains. The role of the independent media in keeping the story alive was also a subject of praise and scrutiny. Patel acknowledged that without the initial reporting by local journalists, many of these discrepancies might have gone unnoticed for several more years. He encouraged a more robust era of investigative journalism that is not afraid to challenge the narratives provided by powerful political officers. The hearing underscored the fact that in a digital age, information cannot be suppressed forever, and truth-seeking remains a core component of a healthy republic. The synergy between journalistic inquiry and congressional oversight was presented as the ultimate defense against systemic corruption. In his closing remarks, Kash Patel summarized the case as a test of the American resolve to maintain a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He argued that the evidence of financial misconduct, potential international money laundering, and the exploitation of the poor creates a moral imperative for action. The committee's final report is expected to serve as a roadmap for future investigations into the intersection of political power and private wealth. The goal is not just to punish the guilty, but to harden the system against future attempts at subversion. The legacy of this hearing will be defined by the legislative and judicial actions that follow in its wake. The final legal hurdle remains the standard of proof required for a criminal conviction in federal court. While the congressional hearing has established a compelling narrative, the Department of Justice must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the Congresswoman had direct knowledge and intent. Patel expressed confidence that the trail of digital evidence and witness testimonies would be sufficient to meet this burden. He noted that several key players in the fraud scheme have already begun to cooperate with federal investigators, potentially providing the internal testimony needed to bridge the gap between the nonprofits and the political office. The coming months will likely see a series of high-stakes court appearances that will captivate the national attention. Ultimately, this document portrays a high-stakes investigation into whether a political network enabled systemic criminal activity and national security threats. It is a story of a search for truth amidst a landscape of complex financial maneuvers and political resistance. The transcript serves as a reminder that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, particularly when it comes to the management of public resources. As the session adjourned, the sense of gravity in the room was palpable, reflecting the weight of the accusations and the potential impact on the future of American governance. The pursuit of justice continues, driven by the belief that no one is above the law and every dollar meant for a child must reach its destination. This concludes the detailed 5-part analysis of the confrontation between Kash Patel and Ilhan Omar. The narrative has traced the path from local campaign finance irregularities to a massive federal fraud scheme with international implications. Through rigorous inquiry and the presentation of forensic evidence, the investigation has laid bare the vulnerabilities of the current system and the urgent need for reform. The American people now look to the judicial system to provide the final word on these allegations and to ensure that the integrity of their government is preserved for future generations.